Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Access Vikings podcast. I'm Emily Leiker, and the whole Minnesota Star Tribune crew is back today. Andrew Krammer and Ben Goessling join me. We're 16 days, I think 16 days, if I counted right, away from the NFL draft. It's getting closer. How's everyone feeling?
I don't think it's even that many, is it?
No, we're nine.
Nine.
Oh my God, I added a week.
Come on, how your countdown clock is a week off? How did that happen? Don't you have a countdown clock hanging in your house or apartment somewhere?
I guess I need one, clearly. I need one right behind my computer so I don't make that error again. We're 9 days from the draft, everyone.
We have a countdown clock in every room of this house that we share, other than Emily's room. Star Tribune Central. The one room that we didn't put a countdown clock in is Emily's room.
Yeah.
Scratch that. We're 9 days away from the draft. How's everyone feeling? Just over a week out.
Oh, can't wait. Yeah, can't wait. Staring up at the clock, just waiting for the seconds to tick down to where the Vikings are finally on the clock, and then they trade back.
Yes.
That's a likely scenario. Although they've picked 23 or 24 so many times, and that pick almost always falls right on top of our deadline. So a trade back actually would not be the worst thing in the world, because then we just say, all right, we got a punt on it for this edition. So trade up or trade back, I would be okay with it from that perspective. So otherwise, we'll be ready to turn a story pretty quick for that first edition, because that pick will fall right on top of it.
We're talking about the trenches today, the offensive line and defensive line needs the Vikings still have and could address in the draft. Ben and I talked about defensive backs last week. You can find that episode anywhere you listen to the podcast. That was a fun one. We got into some potential big board dance rankings that I may be looking into for our defensive backs that need to fill. I don't know, maybe. We'll see. Oh. We have 9 days for me to figure it out before the draft.
I thought you had something going and you just wanted to keep it secret.
No. We'll get to it. But Ben, you have done the written preview on the offensive line. Let's just start with kind of an overview of where that position group stands entering the draft.
Yeah, it's interesting with that, because they obviously make the big investments in Ryan Kelly and Will Fries, and this was something that Kevin O'Connell was not shy about saying needed to be fixed after that 9-sack playoff loss to the Rams. So the question, I think, becomes, do they still feel like adding a left guard, or do they go back to Blake Brandel? And it was interesting that Kevin O'Connell talked about this at the owners' meetings last month. Essentially said, Blake could be better with Christian Darrisaw back, and then you have Ryan Kelly now to his right. But he did he said something about Blake or whoever we bring in to compete with him. So there is, I think, still a preference toward competition in that room. And if you are going to do that, I think it's possible that they invest a high pick, possibly the first round pick, in another lineman to kind of fortify that group. They have had enough issues with it for a long time, as we've talked about, as we've joked about on this show, of all of the years Andrew and I have been covering changes at the guard position. And if they were to go invest there are a number of places they could go. Do we want to get into the ones on my list already, or are we just talking in general terms?
Let's wait another second and we'll get into the list in a minute. Right. Andrew, I'll toss it to you for the other side of the line, the defensive side. Where does that position stand? We know obviously Jonathan Allen and Javon Hargrave are both added there, but what do you think the level of need is for the Vikings potentially adding in the defensive trench?
Yeah, Harrison Phillips is 29. Jonathan Allen's 30. Javon Hargrave is 32, right? Are going to be at least. And so they're a little long in the tooth. I think even with those guys they brought in, because of the age, Will Fries is at the prime of his career on the offensive side. Ryan Kelly is a little bit older, but the need might not be as immediate, I wouldn't think, as on the defensive side, where you might want to add a contract in the first round that gives you 5 years of team control for a top-notch guy like a Derek Harmon, who we might talk about, or any number of guys in this class who might fit them on the back end of the first round, especially if they trade back. Like everybody thinks. So right now, I think it's a sneaky need for them, and one that people are talking probably enough about because of the age of their current starters. And you've got some young guys that they really, really like: Jalen Redmond, Taki Taimani, Levi Drake Rodriguez. There's enough projects for Brian Flores and his staff to work with on this defensive front, but this whole offense, or this whole front office, has kind of shifted toward prioritizing the trenches. And this might be the podcast where, regardless if we're talking O-line or D-line, we might mention their first round pick, considering where they seem to be prioritizing their assets. And yeah, we know how much Flores loves to blitz. We know how they can scheme up pressures, but Philadelphia and so many teams show us year after year that a 4-man rush is still the most dangerous thing in football.
Andrew, you mentioned it there a little bit. Ben and I talked last week about how that number 24 pick, should the Vikings hold on to it, obviously there's some discussion of, is that one they're going to trade away? But should they hold on to it, it really feels like there's an argument in kind of every single direction, or at least those 4 main positions of safety, cornerback, offensive line, defensive line, that any of those could be the reasonable first round pick. Like, which way are you leaning? Where do you think they will go? Just kind of where we're at right now.
Yeah, corner makes a ton of sense. I wasn't on the pod with you guys last week, but I'm sure you guys talked through all the reasons why that would make sense. And then how could you argue with Flores taking a safety when Harrison Smith is, you would think, in the last year, but we keep saying that every year. Flores is going to find a way to take a defensive back who plays a ton of positions, moves him around, does whatever he needs to do with the guy. So whether it's a corner, safety, whatever label they want to put on it, it's a guy who's going to play a lot of different roles, probably, if it is a first rounder. So I can't sit here and say that we know which way they're going to go. Nobody does. But these 4 positions, the last podcast and this one, certainly would be the top priorities for them, it would seem. And at corner, they just don't have a ton of options. Did they really replace Stephon Gilmore, or in Isaiah Rodgers and who am I missing? Jeff Okudah. Yeah, did they really just bring back guys who can fill a Shaq Griffin type role, and they're expecting a big Mekhi Blackmon jump and all these things? It would just seem to me that they could really use a first round talent, an early round talent at corner as well. So, but again, if it's a safety, who's going to argue with Flores and the vision that he's certainly going to set? So it could be any of them.
Well, yeah, I mean, the corner thing, just to touch on it briefly, and we don't need to go back to it a whole lot, but yeah, the Isaiah Rodgers piece of it is really interesting, just given what O'Connell had to say in Palm Beach a couple of weeks ago. I mean, he talked about Rodgers in a way that I frankly was not expecting in terms of playing. He talked about, we see him being a big contributor to this defense and how excited Brian Flores is about Isaiah Rodgers. So, I mean, we'll see. That may solve some of those needs. But yeah, I think corner still makes a lot of sense. It's not a position that you ever can sleep on for too long. And we've seen efforts to fix that over the years. And we've seen what happens when there are needs. I mean, we saw it last year in that kind of frenzy they made at the beginning of training camp to fill that position, kind of culminating with Stephon Gilmore coming in August. But it's a position that needs investments. So I think that makes a lot of sense. I think the ones that we're actually talking about today, on the lines of scrimmage, I mean, yes, it would be those 4 between corner, safety, offensive line, defensive line. I think that make a lot of sense for them to go to in the first round.
Again, you can listen to Ben and I talk about those defensive back prospects in our previous episodes, but let's go ahead and dive into this group. We'll start on the offensive side. Andrew, how about you give me your first kind of offensive lineman pick on your big board, or your mini big board, we'll say.
Well, I would say if you're the Vikings and you're projecting who could be there at 24 or later, because I've got one name for later rounds. But Ben, you and I talked before the podcast, or we all did, about Gray Zabel, the South Dakota kid who went to North Dakota State, a guy who played 4 different positions at NDSU, somebody who could maybe slide in at guard, where people view his long-term spot in the NFL. Like, if we're starting with a name, I think that's the one I would kind of throw out there as a guy who just makes a ton of sense in that spot. I mean, Ben, I assume you have him kind of in your target for that spot as well.
Yep. So he was one of the names that I looked at, and I worked on a preview of the offensive line group for some of the position previews we're doing. He was in there. And I think for a lot of the reasons you mentioned, he's basically played everywhere from center to tackle. I mean, I think he's played all 5 spots. So versatility is helpful. I mean, they don't need somebody to bounce around. You're not trying to take a swing offensive lineman with your first round pick, but it doesn't hurt if you have to move things around in the event of an injury. He has been somebody that has some mobility. He's more of a zone type guy, probably zone scheme type guy than some of the other guys we've seen. I think ran pretty well at the combine, 36.5-inch vertical, I think 26 reps on the bench. So he's athletic and it would fit some of what they need. The other guys that I talked about there are a little bit of a different fit. Like Tyler Booker from Alabama may end up being the first guard to go, would play on the left side. He's like 326 pounds. So if you're putting him next to Christian Darrisaw, that's a pretty well fortified left side of that line. The question with a guy like that would be when he's played more gap scheme stuff, and they've gone to more of this in their running game over the last year and a half, does that fit what they want? Or do they want somebody that even as they put in more downhill type runs that can still kind of major in the zone scheme stuff that they have used over the past, number of years? I mean, more so in the Mike Zimmer, Kevin Stefanski, Gary Kubiak world probably than this has been. But do you want to move in that direction with a Booker or a Donovan Jackson from Ohio State? Those were the other ones that were kind of on my radar in the first round. Bigger guards, a little more mauler types, probably a little more like Will Fries. So maybe that's the move, but I think Zabel makes a lot of sense for a lot of the reasons that we talked about.
When you talk about the gap scheme stuff, that's interesting because Jordan Mason, coming from San Francisco, ran a ton of that, and he succeeded a lot in that. And then Indianapolis as well ran a lot of that with Jonathan Taylor behind Ryan Kelly and Will Fries. So maybe they do see a shift with Aaron Jones, who's capable of running anything. Maybe they do see a shift toward more of that, and maybe one of these offensive linemen could help. One guy I wrote down for later rounds, Jacob Bayer, a center out of Arkansas State, is somebody who actually the Vikings hosted on a pre-draft visit on April, I believe it would have been 7th last week. And they bring him in because he came back from an ACL in 5 months last year. It was an incredible story to still rank second in the conference, or second team all conference in the Sun Belt for Arkansas State. And so he's not playing the top power, 5 competition all the time, but he's somebody that, as they look for options, whether it's Michael Juergens, 7th round pick in his second year, Ryan Kelly's not going to be here forever. And I imagine they're going to be looking at centers, not only potential options in early rounds, but also later rounds for guys who can come in and be developmental types who can take over at some point, because this roster right now doesn't have a ton. We talk about Blake Brandel and the competition at left guard. Right now, Walter Rouse is probably the top in-house competition for him. Dalton Reisner, I believe, signed elsewhere. Not that they were clamoring to keep a hold of him necessarily. So I do think they're going to be looking at these guys both early, middle, and late rounds to bring in not just potential starters, but guys who could develop into those starters in 2 to 3 years.
Yeah, the center thing is interesting because Kelly, you could basically get out of that deal after a year without, a much dead money. I think there would be some, but that deal is not such that they have to keep him in 2026. And so it may be a 1-year thing if you feel like Juergens is ready to be the center. I think a lot of it this year was not wanting JJ McCarthy working with an inexperienced center. You want somebody that's got a lot of time in that seat, so to speak, that's spent time setting protections and understanding what defenses are going to try to do to a young quarterback. So can Juergens learn enough in a year that he becomes that guy, or do they move him to guard? I mean, I think that's going to be an interesting, subplot to watch on the future of that offensive line, because it may dictate some of what they try to do. If they say, you know what, if we see Juergens as a guard, maybe you are looking for another center. I think that's one of those kind of down the road things to watch. But yeah, that whole scenario, Ryan Kelly is not probably the center that JJ McCarthy will play with for the rest of his career, and may not play with him much longer than this year. I think that's certainly one of those down the road subplots to keep an eye on.
Yeah, whether it was concussions, the right knee injury last year that required multiple surgeries, Kelly's got a laundry list of injuries. I mean, he's tough. No one's questioning that, but this center, this hypothetical center we're talking about, could be playing this year too. We'll see.
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, speaking of injured guys, but also going back to our gap scheme convo that we had there at the start, my upboard player for offensive line was Georgia guard Tate Ratledge. Yeah. He was a big gap scheme guy. He's big, 6 foot, 6.5 inches, 308 pounds, and he ran a sub 5 second 40 at the combine. So he's a fast guy. He can move around quick. He's real athletic, but he missed 4 games last season with a sprained MCL and then a sprained ankle. Obviously those aren't big injuries, but I just wonder, when you already have these older guys that have injuries on your offensive line, do you bring in a younger guy who also already has some injury history, or do you go and try and find a younger guy who's maybe not as good, but is healthy and has been healthy. I like a lot of the other names we've thrown out. My sleeper pick that I think Andrew said he hadn't even heard of. I don't know if Ben had heard of him.
Nope.
This is my little ACC shout out. Was Boston College tackle Ozzie Trapilo. Boston College has like a quietly very good offensive line most years. Like they kind of like
out of there, right?
Yes. Yeah. They just kind of churn out these like blue collar, like workhorse offensive linemen. And obviously I think because it's the ACC and then because it's Boston College in the ACC, they don't always necessarily get a ton of attention, but he's a huge guy, 6'8", 316 pounds, great pass blocking, great last season. Yeah, I know, right? He's one of those guys that I think would just be like very consistent. Like, I don't think he's going to wow anyone. I don't think he's going to come in and be a starter right away necessarily, or even a starter long term, but I do think he could be a spot guy and come in and at tackle right now, it feels like that's maybe like what they would be looking for. I mean, you still have Brian O'Neill. You're hoping that Christian Darrisaw is back at 100%. I'm assuming that's something we can get an update about here in the next week or so with Kwesi talking and then Kevin talking. But he's my sleeper pick, and it sounds like a real sleeper because neither of you had heard of him.
Well, the Vikings do have their swing tackle, right? And the former Buccaneers guy they brought in, Justin School.
Yep.
Yeah. So they've got one guy. They have their Questenberry, but you're right. They don't have like this kind of up and comer that they're trying to groom. And maybe right now they're not looking for that, but there's no real even fourth option that I could think of if Walter Rouse is going to be a guard, as we're all talking about.
I will stay in the ACC for my sleeper. Jalen Rivers from Miami has been a tackle in college, but looks like a guy that this dimensions may be a little better fit for a guard in the NFL. 6'5.5", 319, longer arm guy. So you have a lot of the size and the length that you want at that position. Probably a little small for that position to play tackle in the NFL, but has moved well. Has shown he has the size to play that spot. I think has been a guy that's got injury history, though. I mean, that's going to be the question with him. I think a knee in 21 and then had an injury at the end of 24 that was undisclosed, but limited his playing time towards the end of last season. So probably a mid-round guy there, but that's one name that I could see being interesting to them based on some of the skill sets he brings if they feel good about his health.
We should mention too, and I already threw out my late round sleeper, and I did this backwards. I should have mentioned Ariante Ursary, not somebody who I think we would expect the Vikings to be in on, because this guy could be a second round pick and a starting offensive tackle. But we've also seen Daniel Falele, a massive offensive tackle, move into guard at the next level when it didn't always work out, although he was a fourth round pick. So Ursary seems like more of a guy who's cut to be a tackle in the NFL. He's probably going to be the top local kid taken in terms of Gophers, local prospects from the Twin Cities area. He was the guy that had Daniel Jeremiah, hooting and hollering on the combine broadcast because he was running 20 miles an hour at 6'6", 330. He's just an incredible athlete for the size that he is. His former coaches, his parents talk about he's always been that way as a youngster. And one of the stories they talked about with him is how when he first got into football, and it wasn't until early in his high school days, they thought he should have been, or they thought he was a walk-on varsity kid, and he was just kind of this, I think he was actually an 8th grader coming onto the JV team just because of the pads and how he looked physically, first guy off the bus type stuff. So he's going to be, I think, the name that if you're following Twin Cities sports and you care about the kids that are from around here, he's obviously the huge name that everybody's going to know about, and we're probably going to hear pretty early on in this draft process. Certainly somebody with a combine that only raised his stock. Over 20 miles an hour. I think he weighed in officially at 331 pounds.
Man,
crazy.
That's you don't see linemen like that move that fast very often. I mean, it's just that's a level of, I mean, you're at that weight, you're able to put a lot of force into the ground that helps propel you forward, but you have to be able to move that much body and that much weight effectively. So for him to be able to do that, that's an awfully impressive athletic feat. So, and the Gophers have had a number of these guys, John Michael Schmitz a couple of years ago, and Falele, you mentioned, they've turned out NFL offensive linemen who have been able to forge careers. So I would think that, I mean, we see it every year at the Pro Day. There are more teams there. There are more scouts there. I mean, basically at this point, they have produced enough NFL caliber players that I think they get more attention in that regard, and that can only help Ursary in his draft process as well.
Yeah, Gopher fans will remember that big game against Penn State where they were about to beat Penn State at the end, and PJ calls the fake play. It was a little kind of bubble screen to Ursary on the side, and Abdul Carter, the potential number 1 or number 2 overall pick, ends up sniffing that out for Penn State. But he's such a good athlete. PJ Fleck was like, yeah, we're going to throw to this guy on the perimeter from the 10-yard line in a huge game, and just a call that he obviously, PJ got eviscerated for here locally.
Yeah, Dan Campbell likes stuff.
Yep.
There's nothing better than a big man catching a pass in a game, especially a big game. Like that's just highlight football.
Especially when it's being eligible and the ref sees it.
Yeah, Dan Skipper. If that would have worked, PJ would have been. Yeah, it would have been to beat Penn State, or I can't remember the game situation, but certainly the game was in the balance. But yeah, that would have been incredible. And instead, it's the dumbest move ever.
That's always the thing. We judge a lot of these things in hindsight based on the result, not the process.
Yeah.
Those are some of the offensive names to keep an ear out for who might be potential options for the Vikings. Let's switch on to the defensive side, which I think I'm personally starting to feel falls at the bottom of this list of 4 positions we're talking about because of the additions they made on the interior. Again, it's all like up at the top. It's all very close, but I think I would put everything else, it's at the bottom of those 4 very close positions for me personally. But Ben, you seem to disagree. Let's hear your disagreement and then who your first player is.
Well, so the reason I scratched my head at this, and if you're watching on YouTube, you can see the head scratching. If you're not, I was scratching my head. I'll walk you through it. It's not that exciting, but they've done a fair amount of work on the defensive linemen. And I wonder there, if they're doing that kind of work, how loud Brian Flores's voice has been. My sense is that there's been a push from him and a push from that defensive staff of let's continue to add to this group. They have enough other needs. Offensive line is certainly high on that list as well. Maybe they figured they handled it with the Allen and Hargrave signings, but I could still see them saying, let's get one more. And we talked about it early in terms of those 2 guys, Hargrave and Allen, are not the youngest, and they're both also coming off of injuries. So I could see it being something they do, and there's a lot of depth in that defensive tackle class this year. So maybe it's something they wait on. Maybe they trade back and you poach another day 2 pick out of it somewhere in the process and you address it at that point. But I don't know. It's just one of those spots that even with the additions they made, which I think it's a good point. I mean, they've got a lot more help there than they've had. I just wonder if they'll say, let's continue to build that group and build it with somebody younger. So, the names, we talked a little bit about Walter Nolan. I am curious about him, given the pass rush ability he has. He's also one that he transferred colleges and I think transferred high schools 2 or 3 times as well. So we've heard Kevin O'Connell talk a little bit about the transfer stuff over the last couple of years. And one of the questions it makes him ask is, how is that guy going to do in the NFL if his role in year 1 is not exactly what he wants, or he's playing for a coach that he doesn't connect with right away? He talked a little bit about there's an easy button now in college where you could transfer and just kind of move around to a situation that's better for you. That doesn't exist in the same way in the NFL. So, a lot of what you read and hear about him is that the cultural fit and the ability to coaches to come alongside him will be a lot of what dictates whether he's successful in the NFL. He's really intriguing, I think, if they felt good about him. So, and there are a lot of guys, Kenneth Grant, certainly Harmon from Michigan at the top of that list. You go down to Tyleik Williams and some of the other guys. Derek Harmon from Oregon, I should say Mason Graham from Michigan at the top of the list, who will be gone by the time the Vikings are picking. But it's a good group, but Nolan was interesting to me for some of those reasons. Andrew, I think you had him on your list as well, didn't you? Walter Nolan?
Yeah. And he's the kind of pass rushing type that, I mean, All-American last year, 6.5 sacks, the kind of guy that they just could groom into, you would seem could groom into that kind of disruptor 3-tech that frankly they haven't had since Sheldon Richardson or, to a lesser extent, Tom Johnson way back in the day. But and also when you talked about Kenneth Grant, it made me think of just this class has a bunch of different body shapes, sizes. You got the big nose tackles. You got these slender pass rushers they could add. And the Vikings have also hosted among the 15 top 30 visits that we know about, and then we've been able to confirm 8 of them. They've hosted 4 different defensive tackles, 3 of them from Georgia. So they really like Georgia's defensive line that they've been bringing in. They hosted Warren Brinson, defensive tackle from Georgia, Nazir Stackhouse from Georgia, and then Tyrion Ingram Dawkins, also from Georgia, in addition to Derek Harmon out of Oregon, who could be certainly the number 24 overall pick if he's still there. But when I'm looking at their roster, what they don't have is that Haloti Nada true 3-4, block eating nose guard.
Joseph.
Yeah, when we talk about Kenneth Grant,
but still. Yeah.
Kenneth Grant is 6'4", 331, somebody who would immediately fit into that, and is a guy who's projected as one of these late first round type prospects. So that's the kind of guy who sticks out to me for this spot. If they were to potentially even trade back and pick up some draft assets and then take a guy like that, because they just don't have that guy. Harrison Phillips has been plugged into that role. And they've tried to be interchangeable with Bullard and Tillery kind of mixing in and playing nose as well. But when healthy, it was Jalen Redmond who ended up taking a lot of snaps in there. Taki Taimani as well, when healthy, was also taking a lot of reps in there. They seem to be searching for answers, the coaching staff did last year. And those guys might grow and develop and become that, but they don't have that kind of blue chip premier talent in the center of that defense. And it speaks to Flores's talent and the coaching staff's talent that they were able to be so good against the run last year without that. And if they could have that, you think about how that could free up other guys on rundowns and for them to try and cover up the pass on first and second down in ways that they might have had to have borrowed from to stop the run without that kind of guy. So to me, when I look at the roster, that's the body type they're missing. I don't know if that's going to give us any clues as to what they'll go after, but this draft class, as we're saying, certainly has a lot of options to choose from.
Yeah, Grant, it's an interesting point because you're right. They have not had that guy. And with him, we have seen a little bit of pass rush with him, I think, in college, and people kind of talk about him being possibly a 3 technique. So, the positions in the gaps get changed around enough in this defense that I don't know that you have to typecast somebody. But if he has some pass rush, somebody that you could keep on the field here and there in passing situations, or just get some pass rush and some push on early downs, I think that's certainly a beneficial thing as well. But yeah, there is a lot of that skill set that they just have not had. And where they would project him, if they took him, could you have him come in and just be that guy that is hard for an offensive lineman to get off of and get to a second level? I mean, they have not been as deep as they are right now with that pass rushing group on the edge in a long time. And if you can keep Jonathan Grenard, Andrew Van Ginkel, Dallas Turner running free and get unblocked rushers because you have somebody in the middle that's eating up blockers, I think that's a valuable commodity as well.
I think Ben mentioned him, but I had Tyleik Williams from Ohio State as my person who catches my eye at that first round spot. Maybe he'll fall there. Maybe he'll be around there. 11.5 career sacks at Ohio State. The numbers dropped a little, but he started his career with a 5-sack freshman year. So I think if you can get him back to that level of production, that would obviously be something I think the Vikings would like. Who has a sleeper, a downboard defensive tackle that they would like to share? It's harder. I think it's harder.
It is. And I mentioned the 3 Georgia guys that they ended up bringing in. The one that stood out to me when I was looking at those 3 guys was Warren Brinson. He was more of the kind of skinnier. He's 6'5". He's only like, 6'5", 315. And somebody who showed the kind of one gap attacking downhill kind of stuff. And when you read his NFL.com draft profile, you read the people who do the scouting work on guys like this who are mid to late round picks. They talk about his potential to grow as a pass rusher and somebody who seems to have the kind of tools that coaches, want to see. And it's tough to know why teams bring in guys for top 30 visits. The reasons are always different. It could be personality, character, it could be medical. It could be just to see how they get along with other guys that they're bringing in, to see what they're like in a group setting, because you don't really get that too often elsewhere throughout this process. So with a guy like Warren Brinson, one of those 3 Georgia defensive tackles, he seemed to show, at least in scouts' eyes and evaluators' eyes, a lot of the kind of talent that the Vikings could use when Ben's talking about a pass rusher who could threaten things up the middle. We know Flores is going to want to take a shot at guys who have that upside. And it's always hard to look into a crystal ball and project these things, because no one would have seen Ivan Pace coming out of school with all that production and said he's going to be a top tier middle linebacker in the NFL. It took Flores seeing that and, banging the table to bring him in after seeing him and meeting him at the Senior Bowl, because he knew that this guy had that quote unquote dog in him, in a way that you can look at stats and you just can't tell. You cannot tell those things. And what is he, 5'10", 5'11", however little Ivan Pace is. I wouldn't have looked at that and said, those are the tools they can win with. So maybe they get a guy like Warren Brinson in there and confirm, or, confirm either way that they like him or don't like him. But that is a guy, at least on the surface, that seems like somebody who they could use with one of those 5th round picks, for instance.
Yeah, we're throwing all these names out here, and Brian Flores is going to pluck someone that we've never heard of, that doesn't seem to fit the bill at all, and then is going to prove us all wrong with how he uses them next season. Ben, did you have anyone else that kind of stood out in this defensive group, maybe lower down?
No, I mean, I think a lot of the names that I had are kind of the ones we've covered already. But yeah, I mean, I think you're right. It is going to be one of those things where they could pull from a lot of places, and Flores is going to have a lot of names down the list. I think, this is always one of those things we talk about Taimani and Redmond too. It's like you could have somebody that is an undrafted guy, especially with as few picks as they have had, that maybe is going to be a contributor fairly early on. I mean, I think you've seen that happen over the last couple of years, and they've shown that they can get those guys into roles fairly quickly. So I think there's a lot of the undrafted guys that probably won't get a ton of attention that could be part of that mix as well. I mean, Yaya Black from Iowa is we talk about these kind of big, powerful defensive linemen that can just eat up blockers. I mean, a 6'5.5", 330, not as big of not as a good of a mover probably as some of the other guys we've seen, but long arms, big hands, probably a little bit of development that would have to happen with him. He's probably a day 2, day 3 pick, something like that. But if you wanted this just kind of big specimen that's hard to move, he's a guy that may be on that list a little ways down the draft as well.
He's from Marshall, Minnesota, and I only know this because we study going into the combine all the Minnesota Ties guys, and I'd seen an interview with him. I think it was at the Senior Bowl, where he said he listens to Adele as his pump-up music.
I love that.
Yep. That is probably not the answer to your dance big board. I wouldn't think, Emily. I mean,
no, probably not.
Than High School Musical or Camp Rock.
She's a little more karaoke. If we find out that the Vikings are doing like karaoke as team bonding, then I might push for that. But you're right.
Didn't we hear about this? Wasn't there like a singing contest? I mean, probably back when Blake Prohl was here, before he went on to be, reality show music star contestant.
Well, they made them all sing the songs. Like rookies had to pick a song and go in front of the group and sing. I don't know if there probably was a competition and a winner, and maybe it was Blake Prohl. Yeah, because he was so good at it.
Yeah.
I don't remember what song he would have sang though, but he had his own songs, didn't he? Like he was a writer. Like he he fancied himself kind of a musician on his own.
Yeah, I think he ended up singing the national anthem in a game, if I'm not mistaken. But yes, I think they did do something like that. Might have been one of those, off-season Kevin O'Connell spring and summer bonding activities we heard about early on, probably especially in 22.
Like the barbecue cookout.
Yep. Which was very controversial last year, wasn't it?
Yeah, because
there were some
the
people
tight ends
did not quite. The tight ends won because they put Johnny Bunt in charge of it, and then no one else did anything else.
Oh, that was it. Yes,
I think
they put their name on the group project.
Yeah, and then the other controversies were the wide receivers, I think, did not actually cook their own food. And Justin Jefferson, it was either Justin Jefferson or Jordan Addison was like, well, why would you expect me to know how to do that? I'm 24. Or
That's
like,
the thing.
I'm
Like, that whole
25.
room is 24-year-old single dudes that probably are not cooking for themselves.
Who have
or
private
cooking
chefs
for a
and
family fairly
dietitians.
often.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
sorry, Justin Jefferson, but you're probably not sitting at home doing that very much. In fact, I don't think he is. I think he's had family here quite a bit that help with some of those things. But yeah, he's
Right.
probably, if he wants to pay a private chef, I think he can afford it.
And then Metellus and Bynum, I think, made really good wings, but they stole another position group's steaks. And so then they got disqualified. So they might need to run that competition back and make it a more even playing field.
Yeah,
if-
didn't you talk to Metellus about? Because I think you told us, or that you tweeted something about what the wings were, and they sounded outstanding.
Yeah, they were.
It's like a jalapeno.
It was like a jalapeno fruity. One. I'll find it.
If that story were to have come out before last season, when we all didn't know what Sam Darnold was going to be and all that, I would have said team culture's messed up. This is going to be a 4-13 team. There's no way they're going to succeed. And then look at that, 14-3, incredible.
Right. Instead, it was a mid-December. Like, we've written all the. What else could go wrong at this point? Of course, things did go wrong a couple weeks after that.
I'm just pulling up your story. It was family recipe. Where was it here? Bourbon peach, and then fire roasted jalapeno wings was the other thing.
Yeah,
that sounds very good.
Yum.
Yeah,
delicious. Yeah. We're gonna talk about other positions in this draft, other prospects in this draft on Thursday's episode. But as a little teaser, if each of you were to pick the one other position the Vikings need to or should draft in this draft that we haven't talked about in these two main episodes, what would it be out of the rest?
We're doing this exercise for the print version of the paper as well. I said wide receiver, and I don't think that's the first round, but having another receiver in that mix, I think, would be helpful both for this year when you're probably dealing with the Jordan Addison suspension. And do you want to pay Jordan Addison in a couple of years? You're going to have to make that decision sooner than you think. So having another guy, I mean, they've used Jalen Naylor. I think they're going to continue to give him opportunities, but I think another investment there. I mean, we'll see if Rondale Moore does anything, but I think another mid-round pick, and receivers are in deep supply in these drafts. I could see that being kind of a sneaky spot to spend a pick.
I would go tight end because I think the only, and I agree with receiver though too. Like it's just Jalen Naylor. He, for every 40-yard catch he had, it just seemed like he was not always reliable and the kind of dynamic threat they wanted him to be at that spot. Certainly not one that they were featuring. But at tight end, you've got Oliver at 28 years old, I believe, entering a contract year to the point where maybe he gets extended, maybe not. Hawkinson, 27 years old, coming off of that ACL, MCL, didn't quite look the same. But Ben, as you were talking about, sometimes there's stages in these recoveries, and maybe this offseason, this year, he will look more like himself after a full, healthy offseason. But they lost Johnny Munt. They lost Nick Muse at the end of last season. The developmental guys that they had been trying to bring along are gone now for various reasons. And so I could see them bringing in some younger talent, maybe with one of those 5th-round picks or whatever. And apparently this is supposed to be an incredibly deep and not only top-heavy, but deep tight end class as well. And one that, they would probably be smart to pick from. Including, Emily.
We can't spoil it now. Maybe it's going to be my pick next week. But yes, Syracuse's
I was trying to tee up your scoop on the
Syracuse's tight end. Syracuse's tight end, Oronde Gadsden, the second, did make a visit last week. He is a receiving tight end. His dad was a receiver for the Dolphins. Right? Back in the 90s into the early 2000s, I believe.
Remember him from my high school years, I think.
Yes, yeah. So obviously has that NFL pedigree. He played football growing up with Dallas Turner, so he has the in-team connection with Dallas Turner. He played against Pat Surtain in high school, so he just grew up in this community that's dominated by all these like NFL players' kids and stuff like that, which obviously is an interesting kind of breeding ground for talent. But yeah, I think I agree with Andrew that tight end is probably at the top, but I think it needs to be a receiving tight end, and that maybe kind of ties us all together here in what we think we need. And I think he would be a good match, but we can talk more about that on Thursday when we'll kind of wrap up our little 3-part position preview. And then next week we have something very fun, or I think it's going to turn out very fun, that we'll drop for you guys as a kind of conclusion to our pre-draft podcast coverage. Of course, we'll have tons of written content on the site. I know Andrew's got a couple good features coming on some prospects. Ben has all his insidery look stuff. Like we've mentioned, the offensive line position preview, our defensive backs previews will be up. They're split into safeties and cornerbacks, so those should be up any day now. But thank you guys for listening and or watching this episode of Access Vikings. And in the meantime, like I just said, check out all our work on StarTribune.com, and we will talk to you again soon.